Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to be taking a look at the concept of reflecting on God's unity and God's continuous recreation in existence in reality. And we're going to do this through the lens, actually, of the second book of Tanya, which is called Shar Hayichad De'emunah, the gateway to unity and faith. And what's very interesting is that when you begin to read this second sefer of the compilation of the books, the works of the Alter Rebbe, the Tanya, so he doesn't immediately address the topic that the book is called by, which is the gateway of unity and faith. He doesn't actually go into that. What he does for many chapters as he begins this book is he discusses how it is that we understand God's existence and workings in the world through creation, and therefore eventually we will come to a greater understanding of exactly what we mean by God's unity. So this is going to be actually a series, with this being the undercurrent of the series, because there's many different ways to approach this, and a lot of different writings on it by not only by the Alter Rebbe. I'm using Chaim Miller's version of his Tanya, which I really, really like. But also the Rav writes many things about it, Rabbi Ginsburg, Rabbi Trugman. We'll be pulling in a lot of different sources to keep looking into this whole question that comes up, and explanation of the Alter Rebbe in the gateway to unity and faith. And today will be mostly an introduction to those underlying concepts, some of them coming from the Baal Shem Tov and the Arizal, through the book of Rabbi Miller. But what immediately should stand out in one's mind as a Jewish person is that twice a day we declare a statement of faith to Hashem in what's called the Shema Yisrael. And that ends with the word echad, which literally means unity. So immediately there is in our prayers every day, on a daily basis, morning and evening, a fusion of the gateway of unity and faith in the Shema. And I just want to read you something from Rabbi Trugman's book as sort of a headline about one of the comments he makes about this concept in general of the Shema. The whole book is called actually Shema Yisrael, so there's a lot of things we could highlight in the book. So he says, contemplating the ultimate unity of God leads to an understanding that everything that happens to us personally, and everything that happens to the world, that we experience in the world at large, is part of a oneness and indestructible unity that is ultimately an expression of God's goodness. I'll just read that again, because although it's a short statement, there's a lot to think about there, especially in today's world. Let's just try and focus on the words. Contemplating the ultimate unity of God leads to an understanding that all that happens to us personally and in the world at large is part of that oneness, that indestructible unity, and it is ultimately an expression of God's goodness. So I'll leave you with that beginning thought as we begin to explore this topic. So I'm working out from Chaim Miller's book called Practical Tanya. So it's called Shar Hayichad De'emunah, and I'm going to work, actually, there's a very interesting introduction in this book that talks about the Baal Shem Tov's concept of mystical consciousness. In order to approach the concepts of unity and faith and the oneness of God, we have to begin to understand some foundational concepts. It's really what drew me to this. And actually, now that I'm saying this, I remember there was another thing I wanted to note, so I'll do that now. So we've been on a journey since Pesach. Me in particular, I've been on a journey since Pesach, or Erev Pesach, but all of the world has been on a journey since Pesach, through the counting of the Omer, through the days of the Omer, in two Shavuos. And that journey consisted of a very interesting combination of aspects, two of which I want to highlight. So we attained a certain level of lowliness, of betul, of humility during the Pesach time that led us into a journey of refining our emotional character traits. So it's called the midos. And that's the whole journey of counting the Omer. And that journey, hopefully some of us and all of us, please God, were successful in actually becoming immersed in that and really thinking into it this year, because that journey is supposed to help us not only fix our own character traits and our own emotional heart set, but it's also meant to help us understand how we are part of a whole, a holistic unfolding of all of the different aspects of not only ourselves, but of God's creation of the world, of God's intention for Am Yisrael, the Jewish people in the world, and indeed of God's intention for the Jewish people and the greater nations of the world. So there's a lot of aspects of inter-inclusion in the Omer that we had 49 days of contemplation. Now that was all the affairs of the heart. That was all about the fixings, the refinement of the midos of the heart, our character traits, right? Our emotional set. And then a very interesting switch happened. And during that whole time, we were still working on the first 53 chapters of the Alter Rebbe's Tanya, Likutei Amarim. As we approach Shavuos, right at the point, it's very fascinating that we approach Shavuos, suddenly we moved into this new book, Sharchi Yichud Ve'amunah. Now, they're very different, and we're going to highlight what some of the differences are in the focus of these two books by the Alter Rebbe and the greater book. It's called the compilation of the Tanya. But one of the differences is, and it's really sharply highlighted when we move from the Omer into Shavuos, is that we move from the emotions into the intellect. We move into receiving the Torah, which is surely the whole level of intellect in a person, Chachma, Bina, and Das, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. So when we move into that set, there's a transition and a foundational connection of how we transition from the emotions of the heart and refining them into the mind, and how that becomes a enlightened space, or a more enlightened space, because we receive the Torah anew on Shavuos. So we're coming from a new space, let's say, a new opportunities of how we're going to perceive things, how the mind is going to guide the heart. And they're both inter-included in each other. They both affect each other. And so that's like the backdrop to how we actually enter not only Shavuos and the holiday of Shavuos and the receiving of the Torah anew, but that's also the backdrop at which there's this interesting change point in the teachings of the Alter Rebbe. So now we'll go back to the beginning of the introduction of Shar HaYichud Ve'amunah, the gateway to unity in faith. So it says, while the Tanya draws on the concepts and terms and sources of Kabbalah in general, this current work, the second book, Shar HaYichud Ve'amunah, seeks to clarify the approach of a particular teacher who worked within this tradition, which is the Baal Shem Tov. So it's going to be bringing out and highlighting some of the aspects that were our inheritance from the teachings of the great Baal Shem Tov. Let us first examine some core values and teachings that emerged from the mystical consciousness of the Baal Shem Tov, and then we'll turn to the Tanya's adaptation and explanation of themselves. It says, the Baal Shem Tov used to say, consider yourself a child of the higher world. And he would tell this to his followers, for the whole of this world is like a mustard seed when compared with the higher world. So we're like a little speck, a little drop in the ocean, so to speak. What is our goal? Okay, everybody, oops, hold on 1 second. Mute people. Okay, sorry about that. So our goal, according to what the Baal Shem Tov is trying to say, is to inhabit, is to acquaint ourselves, is to become practitioners of higher consciousness, of a higher godly consciousness. That's what this whole journey is starting, it's always our journey, but there's a particular focus on the journey, switching from the midos of the heart into the intellect of the mind, the transitions at Shavuos, that we're to inhabit, we're to immerse ourselves in our higher consciousness. And it's going to be crucial in terms of our future unfolding, this ability for us to do this. If someone will remind me towards the end, I will give a very good insight into that. But for now, we're just going to stick with the book. So to do this, we have to retreat from the sensory experience of the world, transcending its allure and demand for our attention, which usually happens on the level of the constant demand of the multiplicity and the details and our everyday mundane lives that, dictate to us many things that we need to do. So that's to a certain extent a veiling of godliness. And the interesting thing is, it's not the most real thing in the world. It's the reality we live in, but it's also somewhat deceptive because we can get very involved in it and forget that our focus is really meant to be that consciousness, that godly consciousness. So the Baal Shem Tov wanted to, from this very beginning of his leadership, he wanted to lead us into a place where we would understand what our goal is. From the beginning, to have a ability to attach to the goal within our physical lives, our mundane lives, our daily lives, that it's about godly consciousness, that our real reality should be tuned into and turned towards and walking on the path towards godly consciousness, or what he calls higher consciousness. So he says, this is Rabbi Miller quoting concepts of the Baal Shem Tov, the tool which facilitates this shift in consciousness is human thought. You know that human beings only have this. There's existence, there's awareness in all creations, even in stones, as we actually will learn from the Sefer Sara Yichud Ve'emunah. But human thought, the process of thought and thinking, is mankind. As the Baal Shem Tov teaches, when you will think of the upper world, and you will be in the upper world, meaning you will think about the indwelling of God and godliness in the world, the infinity and the greatness of God, when you will contemplate this. So the Baal Shem Tov said, wherever a person's thoughts are, that's where he is found. There's a very potent quote and a well-known quote by the Baal Shem Tov, something you could put on your refrigerator and contemplate for at least a month. Wherever a person's thoughts are, that's where the person is, which means you can actually change your reality according to your thoughts and how you're thinking. And we know from previous teachings that we've learned together that you can actually even think of other people, change their reality along with your reality, and send them a healing and a divine adjustment through just thoughts. Thoughts are very potent. So the Baal Shem Tov continues, thought in particular has a unique power. The reason why thought enables a person to endlessly grasp great ideas is because thought is infinite. The godly garment that God gave our soul, thought, speech, and action, thought has an aspect that tunes into infinity. We're not limited in thought. We can think into the future, how things will be. We can rectify the past, how things were in the past. And we can actually even change the current reality that we're in by how we think about it. We know that even when we meet someone, or we're in a gathering with other people, how our perceptions of our thoughts change our relationship actually with people at that moment. if our thinking is maybe in one direction, so we might be closed down and we might not be receptive to like the exchange of new ideas, the exchange of friendship, the ability to build the world together. And if our thoughts move in a different direction and we become receptive and we're very open, so then there are infinite windows that open to possibility of change and building the world of God's goodness. So thought is very, very powerful. And this is something the Baal Shem Tov really wanted to highlight. So Rabbi Miller continues. What exactly, now that we know that thought has an infinite aspect to it and it's so potent, what are we to contemplate in order to reach godly consciousness, higher consciousness? The Baal Shem Tov's most often repeated quotes include, "The whole earth is filled with his glory and there is no place devoid of him." The first one being quite well known. The whole earth is filled with his glory. We are to look at the world, this is the explanation of that. We are to look at the world as saturated with the divine, as saturated with God and godliness. God is the energy which animates all physical forms. He is present in every object, every act, every word, every blade of grass, every event, every relationship, every happenstance, every hashgacha pratis, divine providence, every moment of our lives. God is saturated in life. And there is no reality that is separate from godliness. Okay, so those are some, so let me see if there are a few more introductory things here. Okay, it goes a little bit further in order to help us understand the challenge in what we just presented, this consciousness, and the fact that we live in a world of physical manifestation, which is a lot of duplicity and multiplicity, and how do we, the whole question of how we put them together. So he says, despite the physicality of the world and its robust appearance, and that it appears to be a barrier between us and God, this is how the physical world is. It appears as a barrier between that and this higher divine consciousness. This appearance, and that's what it is, he chose the word appearance, this veil is insubstantial. With the appropriate determination, we can lift our consciousness to penetrate the illusion and be united with God. There's something about our physical world, as real as that reality appears to us, that is actually somewhat of a veiled perception, and it's called an illusion. We can do this not by withdrawing from our physical life, not by withdrawing from it. We're not going to go up on the mountain and like just meditate out in space. We can do this by modifying our perception, which means tuning in our thought processes, using our mind, our intellect, our Chabad. That's what the switch happened on Shavuos when we received the Torah. It's through the Torah that we have the gift of using the processes of our mind. We can attune ourselves to the divine energy, which powers and creates every sensory experience in physical life. We can attune ourselves to what is the underlying real reality and current and existence of every single sensory experience in life. No aspect of reality should be taken at face value, how it appears. Everything is a manifestation of God. We reach God through the world. The interesting paradox that we're presented with in this statement is that the greater level, the greater journey of Am Yisrael, indeed all the peoples of the earth, all the nations of the earth, is through the multiplicity of the physical world and through the challenge of the world. And even in the darkness of the world is that we seek and we find and we discover and we amplify for ourselves and for others the actual unity that is the real reality within that world, that there's only God. Ein od milvado. There is only God. Physical consciousness is illusory in that it tends to hide this truth, obscuring the divine presence which animates the universe. Through the appropriate dedication and devotion to contemplate, and obviously when we're talking about contemplation, we mean that involves learning and then thinking into it. There's something very beautiful I was learning a few weeks ago with Rabbi Trugman on one of his classes. And he made a comment. He said, when he was a student, he's been a student of Rabbi Ginsburg for 40 plus years. I lost count at that point, like how much past 40 years. He said when he was a beginning student with Rabbi Ginsburg and they were learning things. And he said there would be very, very deep concepts. And he would take a lot of notes. He himself was a very deep, highly talented Jewish Rabbi Trugman. We take a lot of notes. And he said, invariably, Rabbi Ginsburg would say, now go home and contemplate what we've learned. And he took this to heart. He understood that Rabbi Ginsburg was giving an instruction. It wasn't a general instruction. So he'd spend all week going over his notes and contemplating in small bites and small bits and looking up other resources and sources that Rabbi Ginsburg had quoted until he would finally come into it, into a place of das, into a place of knowledge, that he actually got it. This practice of contemplation is also the practice of how the Alter Rebbe invites us in the Tanya. And this is actually a way of Jewish life in terms of using our intellectual powers and the gifts that were given through Torah, that we are meant to contemplate. We're meant to go over and realign ourselves and our thoughts with deeper levels of understanding and deeper levels of thinking into the concepts of the Torah and commentary on the Torah and the depth of Penidius of Torah, so that then it comes into us and it actually transforms us. And in doing that, then we come into this level that he began with, this level of higher consciousness, which is a different perspective and viewpoint on what we think is reality. So he's saying we need to devote ourselves to this contemplative work so that this physical reality, which is an illusion, is not the main presence, is not to be taken at face value. And by this dedication and contemplation, we can come into this higher level of mystical consciousness. And our sensory experience becomes filled with the intuitive awareness of God's divinity in everything and in all beings. The gateway to unity in faith is essentially a guide to succeed in this task. So what he's done is he's now told you what is this second book of the Alter Rebbe. He said the gateway to unity in faith is essentially a guide to succeed in the task of being able to use our intellect and all of our contemplative powers of our intellect, especially thought, to be able to reach a higher level of divine consciousness and thereby overcome, not delete, but actually through the window of the multiplicity of our physical lives and the demand of our physical lives, we actually see the true reality, the true undercurrent, the true unity, and the true existence and the true oneness of godliness in everything. So this is the work that he introduces what this book is about. So he says that there comes up to be a question. The question is, how exactly does God become the world? If God, in the consciousness of God, is on such a high level of unification and oneness, how exactly does God become the world? How does that switch happen from godly consciousness, the Godhead, into this physical, illusory world of all its details, which is our reality? And we actually operate in this reality, 99% of the time. It's a real reality. It's not, although it uses the word illusion, it's an illusion in terms of hiding godliness. But for us as physical beings and how we were created, it's real. It's not magic. It's not hocus pocus. It is a real world, and we operate in it, and we have things we have to do in it. So the perception of how that happens, interestingly enough, has to do with how God created the world. And we know that how God created his world, because we just did this, we just got the Torah, the 10 Commandments, how God created the world is that God created the world through 10 statements. God created the world by investing himself in the Hebrew language and the letters of the Hebrew language, and using those letters to make 10 statements of let there be light, let there be, the firmament, let there be the animals and the birds and the fishes of the sea, let there be the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars. These statements of creation, which incorporate combinations of letters, are the key to how it is that we understand this concept of how we're going to switch from only thinking or only seeing or only reacting to our everyday reality and achieve unity with the higher consciousness of God's divinity in all. So what's going to happen is in the book is going to first address prior foundational concepts. Shara Yichud Ve'emunah, the gateway to unity and faith, is first going to take us in a journey that's going to be answer the question, how is it that God became the world? How did that happen? What is the question of God's existence? That's a little bit what we're going to go over today as he begins to address that. There's a lot more here, but I'm going to go forward to this. This is still the author's introduction to the second book, meaning Rabbi Miller. The first book of the Tanya, Sefer Shel Beinanim, guided us on how to achieve an emotional connection to God by generating feelings of love and reference. So the whole Tanya that we just actually completed before Shavuos, the 53 chapters, Sefer Shel Beinanim, is a guide on how to have an emotional, a deep connection, a deep devoted connection to God through generating feelings of love and reference. Now that's like a short statement on a 53 chapter in-depth journey, but he's making a distinction. The second book, this book that we're looking at, Shara Yichud Ve'emunah, the gateway to unity in faith, aims to enrich our intellectual. You notice the switch? The first one was emotional. This one says intellectual. It aims to enrich our intellectual understanding of God's existence and God's unity and God's relationship with the world. A very different goal. In this introductory discourse, the Alter Rebbe will explain how intellectual understanding and emotional connection are related and how one acts as the foundation for the other. Right? There's going to be an attempt to bring together in this part of the Tanya how intellectual understanding and the prior part, that was our journey of emotional connection, are related, and how one acts as the foundation for the other. So we know that Shara Yichud Ve'emunah starts in a very unusual way. It starts with Hanoch Lenar, educate the child in their own way, and when he grows old, he will not swerve from it. I'm not going to actually do a Tanya class. That's not my aim. So you'll have to go back into your Tanya to really understand what that's about. Essentially, what's happening is that there's going to be a very deep explanation through many, many chapters of how foundational education trains the mind to think in godly ways, even to a child. And this is the kunz of Jewish chinuch and education, even to a young child learning the Aleph Beit. or a 3-year-old boy putting on tzitzit for the first time and a kippah on his head. Every aspect of education, although for an adult or even an older adult, or even somebody who's an adult and extremely sagacious and wise and brilliant, a scholar in the Torah, these steps that happen to a child seem like, how could that hold any weight compared to what I know now? But the explanation comes down to that when you habituate through education from a very young age, a child in having godly consciousness, that godly consciousness is always the, let's say, use the word default system, maybe not the best word. It's the core of which we go back to in every situation, whether it be joyous or challenging. We go back to the core of the time that we learned how to say the Shema and started saying brachas, the time that as a little boy he put on his kippah and tzitzit, the time of a little girl learning about sniut and about concepts of just basic Judaism. Every child who learns these, that's what it means, educate a child according to their ways. And when he grows old, he will never depart from it because it became a foundational core. That was just a short. So, but there, in order to, and really what we want to focus on is he says that there are two kinds of, one second, hold on. I have to get to the right place. That the Tanya is telling us that it's sort of like a command, you should love God, but love is a feeling. So there's a question, well, how can you command love? How can you command an action, a doing? That's what a commandment is, do something according to God's will. How can you command an emotion? So the Tanya answers this by saying that there is two types of love, right? There are two types of love of God that we have in general. There's more than actually two types, but we're going to now divide it into just two general categories. He says, how does one command you to feel, to do love? How do you do the commandment of love? The Tanya will answer this question by drawing on a distinction we learned in part 1 of Tanya, Sefer Shalbeinity, that there are two types of love of God. One is essentially only available to a select few, and the other is accessible to us all. There is the higher level of great love, Ahava Rabbah, which is the privilege of tzaddikim and exceptionally pious individuals. And there is the lower level, which is something we can all reach by disciplined meditation. And the only reason I'm bringing this in is because when he starts this book, there's going to be a switch on that, what we learned in the beginning of Tanya. It's going to be that we're going to see that actually even what a tzaddik is able to tap into, that even tzaddikim tap into these core values, which we can also do. It's something that he's going to explain. Let's see if we could just do, I think we're not going to go in that direction of how he does that. Maybe we'll save that for another lesson. But there's going to be a switch in the sense that what I just explained, these foundational aspects of chinuch, of Jewish education, of inculcating faith in a person, is what everyone reverts to if they need to, even a tzaddik. And even if it's naturally your inheritance to love God, which it is, or you have to contemplate on God's greatness and godless in the world and come to a level of understanding of God's greatness and therefore become devoted to God, both of which are ways that are described in the first part of Tanya. So he says, now we're going to turn to the main theme of this particular volume, the Gateway to Unity and Faith in God. The initial step before the foundation of awakening love and reverence in God is pure and devoted faith in God's oneness and non-duality. Let's just highlight that. Even before we can bring into ourselves and actually learn, even as a child, this foundation of awakening love and reverence, ahava and yira of God, we have to have a understanding, we have to have a grasp of a pure and devoted faith to God's oneness, to God's existence in creation, and to God's non-duality, right? So he said the practical techniques for awakening love and reverence of God have already been detailed in the first part of Tanya. These techniques rely upon contemplating God's greatness, and as a foundation to this work, we need to develop a more nuanced understanding of what it means we believe God is one, and why we believe he is non-dual. And it's to the second part of Tanya, Shara Yichud Ve'emunah, that's going to, from an intellectual point of view, explain how it is that we do understand that God is one. Okay, so this is the beginning of the introduction into how a person acquires faith. Okay, let's read this. This is now actually the beginning of the author's opening of chapter 1 of Shara Yichud. The purpose of this book, called the Gateway to Oneness and Faith, is to give you at least a minimal understanding of what the Zohar states. What does the Zohar state? That Shema Yisrael, Hashem, etc., Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, is called the upper unification, or Yehuda Ila'ah. It's an upper level of unity. Upper meaning it's a higher consciousness of God's unity. He's going to explain it more. But he's using that when we're saying the Shema, this is actually what's happening. That's why he's bringing it in. When we're saying the Shema, Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, this is a unification of God's oneness on a higher level of consciousness. Yehuda Ila'ah, upper unification. And then when we say the second statement in the Shema, Baruch Shem Kivol Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, blessed be the name of his glorious kingdom forever and ever. This is called Yehuda Tata. It's the lower level of unification. In the Shema, it covers all the levels of unification, but there is what's called a higher level of unifying in consciousness with God, and there is a lower level of unifying with God in consciousness, and that's going to have an impact on how we perceive God's oneness in the world. And our understanding of God's oneness in the world is going to lead, it's a loop. It's all intertwined with each other. It's going to lead us into greater consciousness. The Torah requires us to recite the Shema twice daily, a series of scriptural passages that open with the declaration of faith in the one God. The basic intention of the Shema, as required by Jewish law, is to declare God as king in the heavens and the earth. But that's according to the Shulchan Aruch. But according to Kabbalah, in the Shema, we affirm not only God's unity in the world, one type of unity. We look at the world, Ein od milvado. There's only God. The world is all God. There's only God. But also unity within God. That needs to be understood. In the first verse of the Shema, Hear, O Israel, God is our Lord and God is one, we affirm that God's powers, which may seem to be diverse, and sometimes God rewards, and sometimes God punishes, are in fact one. This is what the Zohar calls upper unification, that everything of how God appears in the world and how God is acting, his attributes are being displayed, so to speak, in the world, our experience of godliness in the world is that there's only one God. There's only one. It's all God. And in fact, it's all God's goodness, another level of consciousness. But let's stick with just, it's all God. Everything is God. Everything that's happening, from the, volcano eruptions to the joyous celebrations, everything in between. And this is the upper unity, to recognize, hear, O Israel, God is our God, God is one. After saying these words that are from Devorim, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and before continuing with the second phrase, with the second part, which is Devorim 6:5, we say this phrase in between, Baruch Shem Kivol Malchuso Le'olam Va'ed. Blessed be the name of his glorious kingdom forever and ever. This 6-word, Baruch Shem Kivol Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, this 6-word phrase, the Zohar says, represents the 6 directions or energies of the created world that receive energy from God's attributes. We should have this intention when saying this phrase, and it is referred to as the lower unification. Yehuda Tata. Now we're going to go into this actually. We've done this before, but we're going to do a review of it because I'm into reviewing really foundational concepts at this point. I feel like this is where we need to get to. We need to get back into the foundation and the core of our very godly beings. When we studied living in divine space and the 6 duties of the heart, that's what's being talked about here. So in the second sentence of the Shema, Baruch Shem, that's actually pointing at these 6 duties of the heart, these 6 meditative directions that we are in all the time, that we have to live with, called the 6 duties of the heart. And that's the lower unification. That meditation is the lower unification. And the higher unification is to recognize that everything that God does, there's only one God. There's no fractions here. It's just the oneness of God, even though we see these attributes of godliness displayed differently in the world. The Tanya, however, is going to offer a deeper meaning of what the Zohar is terming these 2 aspects. And in order to get to that, we first have to immerse ourselves in the Baal Shem Tov's view of the universe, which is radically different. So this is where it becomes very interesting in Shar Yichud B'Emunah. Although he's telling you, the Tanya is, in this part, we're going to go back to those 2 types of unity. We're going to learn about them. We're going to put them together in the Shema. And we're going to understand how they affect our world and our godly consciousness. Before we can even address that, we have to talk about a basic concept, which is God's continual creation, God as the only true existence. So we're going to get into that a little bit now. This is actually where chapter 1 begins. God's continual creation, the embodiment of the divine energy in creation. And this begins to answer the question of, so how does God become the world? That Chaim Miller asks in the beginning. The simple statement that God is one is in fact surprisingly complex. That's the Shema Yisrael. It seems simple. We say it every day. We're supposed to embrace it, but it is actually complex. Classically, it has been interpreted to mean that God is the one and only real deity and all other gods are false. The Kabbalists, however, were focused on a different concern when discussing the oneness of God. Namely, the Kabbalists are focusing on the unity within God. While God interacts with the universe through his different attributes or powers, we must be careful not to give these powers and attributes a separate identity from God. They are, in fact, merged with God in a total seamless unity, something that is beyond our full comprehension. So when we look at the world, and when we try to makabel events that are happening in the world, we may have like our devoted attachment and belief and understandings of God. And then other events that happen seem to be beyond our comprehension. We're not able to relate to them. They're beyond what we can understand. There's one thing we do need to understand, is that this is all God, and there's only God, and there's only one God. That there is no duality or duplicity acting here. And this is why the Kabbalists were concerned with a different discussion which is this oneness of God and how God is within the world of existence. He continues, Rabbi Miller, many Kabbalistic texts have been devoted to this theme, and it will be the concern of the present work, part 2 of the Tanya, especially from chapter 8 onwards. Here, in the first part of our book, Shar HaYichud V'Emunah, this part of the Tanya will elaborate upon another dimension of God as one. All of this coming through the Baal Shem Tov and the Arizal. It is a theme which became a cornerstone of the Hasidic revolution of the Baal Shem Tov, though it can be traced to earlier Jewish sources, meaning it's usually attributed to the Baal Shem Tov because it was the Baal Shem Tov's persona that actually brought it out into the world. And that is that God is the only true existence. This is a big idea to wrap our head around. The more we will learn about it, a little bit easier it will become, and especially when faced with challenges, to be able to, it's sort of like chinuch of the young child. This is a retraining of core values, that God is the only true existence. In the midst of today's world, we have to be able to revert back to really understanding and believing in that and being attached to it. This is not to say that the world does not exist. It does. Rather, that the world's existence is contingent upon God, and therefore the world has no independent existence. But God is the true existence. Hasidic thought discerns this truth in the following verse. And this verse is from Devorim 4-39. And you shall know today and take to your heart that God is God in the heavens above and the earth below, and there is none else. There is none else can be read. There is no other independent existence at all besides God. Ein od milvado. We're only talking about God. You shall take to heart. It's speaking to me, the prayer. And you shall know today and take into your heart that God is God in the heavens above and in the earth below. The Tanya will devote several chapters to explain this idea. We need to clarify a question that happens when we hear this verse. Would it be that a person would really think that there's a deity inhabiting the waters below the earth? Because it says, right? You should know today and take to heart that God is God in the heavens above and on the earth below. Would we think that there's some other deity, okay, God is in heaven. On earth, there's other forces operating here. Is that really something we would fall into? That it makes us take it to heart, the statement that God is one? What's the emphasis here? So the verse instructs us to take this message to heart, suggesting that some serious contemplation is required. Again, we go back to devoted learning and meditation in order to acquire and train our thought processes to understand the truth. It's always an immersion in learning and relearning and reviewing and contemplation. Why would we even think differently? God is God. That we would think there's something else going on. Is the notion that God or deities inhabiting the waters below sufficiently credible that we have to take to heart? What is the truth? Okay, so that's part of the question that's coming up in us understanding God's existence in the world. In order to answer this very question, that Rabbi Miller and the Tanya are going to address the following mystical concept. And this mystical concept is the beginning of understanding God's existence in the world and God being in the world. In it, the verse states, let's see where it is from, Tehillim 119. The verse states, "Forever, O God, your word stands in the heavens." Forever, O God, your word. We're talking about the words of the statements of Bereshit, the 10 statements of creation. Forever, your word stands in the heavens. And the Baal Shem Tov of blessed memory explained this verse as follows. This is from Kesser Shem Tov. While the following teaching is actually sourced in the Midrash of Tehillim, the Tanya attributed to the Baal Shem Tov, since he popularized it and taught it as a practical basis of worship. The Baal Shem Tov explained your word, God, that you said in the 6 days of creation, such as let there be light, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, etc. These Hebrew words and their constituent letters stand forever in the heavens. This is a wonderful contemplation to have on a daily basis before prayer, that God's letters of creation are standing forever, pulsating and emanating creation into existence forever. All these otiyot that God put together in the 10 statements. The energy of those letters is embodied in all the heavens forever to energize them, what God spoke. So we have to pay particular attention, if we want to look at the Chumash again in Bereshis, what are those letters that comprise the 10 statements of creation? Because those are the foundational letters. And then through those letters, we actually learned this last year, we may review it again. There are, I think, more than 200, I don't have it at my fingertips right now, more than 200 substitutions, alterations, combinations that comprise the creation of all things in existence. That everything is found in those statements, but it could be through a way of substitution or transitioning the letters into different arrangements that actually brings about the creation of everything, but everything is in those 10 statements. As the verse states, the word of our God shall stand forever. And we also say in the morning prayer, your word lives and sustains forever. That's from our morning prayers. Normally, we look at language as a convention to describe something which is real and actual. For example, a chair exists regardless of what we call it. The word chair is merely a label that we all agree upon so that this piece of furniture can be identified. We'll all speak the same language, even if it's in Spanish, French, or Italian. It's going to be called a chair, or Hebrew, kisei. We're still going to be able to identify when we say we need another chair at the dining room table, we have another guest. It's functional. Here, the Tanya invites us, this part of the Tanya, in order to explain the unity of God, in order to get to the unity and oneness of God, it's going to explain how God is the only true existence, and that this happens through the statements and the otiyot of creation. Here, the Tanya invites us to re-envision the relationship between language and reality. The universe, we are told, only exists by virtue of the divine Hebrew language. Your word stands forever in the heavens. The whole of existence and all of its aspects and everything that we call creation is only because Hashem chose the letters of the divine Hebrew Aleph Bet and used them when he spoke into creation, the words of creation, and that those letters are alive forms, and he calls them, it's wonderful, let's see if I could find that. We're going to get to it in a minute. He calls them packets of divine information. Right? So the universe and the reality that we know or that we think about only exists by virtue of the divine Hebrew language, which means language is reality and existence is convention. That the actual language of the Hebrew alphabet and the words that Hashem spoke at the beginning of creation is what causes creation to come into existence. The importance of that is to be able to reflect upon that God is the only true existence. Because when we see reality and we reflect upon the fact that what we're experiencing as a mundane physical reality is being brought every moment, every rega moment, yesh ma'ayin, into existence through the divine channels of the Aleph Beit, then we realize that there's this undercurrent of unity pulsating everything into creation, and that it all points towards the fact that there is nothing but God. There's nothing but God. Anything we experience of reality is only a manifestation through Hashem's Gadlus of bringing something into existence through these letters of the Aleph Beit. The words with which God creates the universe are not incidental or merely a label of convenience. They are the very energy of the universe, the very power which endows us with the concept that we call existence. The letters are more real than the universe itself. The universe happens to exist because God has uttered a particular set of otiot, of letters and words. This is a comment, a side comment, a summary comment by Rabbi Miller. While they are recorded just once in the Torah, God's 10 creative statements are uttered continuously to endow the universe with existence. If God's creative statements would stop, even for one moment, the universe would cease to exist. Let's just go through that again. While the 10 statements of creation are recorded only once in the Torah, in Bereshis, God's 10 creative statements are uttered continuously. They stand forever in the heavens. They are being continuously uttered by God. We are being continuously brought into the real reality of godliness that we call creation, to endow the universe with existence. If God's creative statements would stop even for a moment, the universe would cease to exist. There's a much greater teaching on this, but God's universe would cease to exist. And so Rabbi Miller says, so look at the world as a vibrant, pulsating garment of the divine, an enclothement of the divine. There is the divine, and what we call mundane reality, our world, is an enclothement of the divine through those otiot. And here he says, and I'm going to conclude here, that the letters are a linguistic godly vehicle through which an idea may be expressed. God's letters are vehicles or packets that deliver divine creative energy to the world, which is crucial to its existence. The letters that God spoke in the 10 statements of creation are vehicles, channels, they're carrying, right? They're packets that deliver, and meaning that when you open them up, they're going to hold a lot of divine creative energy that are being delivered to the world, which are the essence of God is the only existence in the world, and that is how God endows existence to come into being, what we call reality, the world that we live in. So we're going to stop here because it's going to go in another direction, which we're going to explore at a different lesson. And now I want to repeat what it is that we said at the very beginning by Rabbi Trugman about Shema Yisrael. Maybe it will hold a different level now. He says, contemplating the ultimate unity of God, which we just did, leads to an understanding that all that happens to us personally and in the world at large is part of the oneness, the complete indestructible unity, and is ultimately an expression of the one God, and therefore God's goodness, the one God. So we started to delve into that. There's a lot to be said about it, but we will continue. Okay, we're gonna close this like that.